This video comes across as blasphemous and offensive. Great care has been taken to present everything as neutrally as possible without taking sides, but the result is still not for the faint-hearted. If you're allergic to political incorrectness, this video is not for you. You have been warned. This book contains, even according to my present-day judgment, the most valuable of all the discoveries it has been my good fortune to make. Insights such as this falls to one's lot but once in a lifetime. Sigmund Freud, The Interpretation of Dreams. These lines have always stuck with me because you notice this in all human works, and especially art. It's over 10 years since the release of one of the best video games ever made, Bloodborne. Bloodborne is From Software's magnum opus due to a convergence of symbolism, story, philosophy and more into a coherent whole. Here's 5 specific reasons that immediately stand out. Bloodborne has amazing atmosphere, sound design, and is genuinely scary to play. It contains a great plot twist right after killing Rome, though the effect is reduced if one has been reading item descriptions. It explains why the character can always respawn upon death, through the hunter's dream being beyond normal time and space. As mentioned in a video by Soul Purpose, it contains various inversions of myths. This is very important, but sadly beyond the scope of this video. One of the inversions is making the player feel insignificant, as they are puppeteered by powerful forces beyond comprehension. This subverts our sense of purpose and meaning that is ever present in games and art in general. It is uncommon for a work of art to exhibit this, and Bloodborne does it perfectly. A decade later, and to my knowledge, and after extensive internet search, I'm the first person who finally discovered what Bloodborne is really about. Such extraordinary claim requires equal evidence. I've been putting the pieces together for the last year, and now it's time to share. Let's begin. Bloodborne. What is Bloodborne? The word itself means carried by blood. The question, therefore, has 2 different and interconnected meanings. 1. What is the game about? 2. What is being carried by the blood? To answer these 2 questions, we will go over the work of Lovecraftian philosopher Nick Land. Let's set the stage first. This video assumes that you are at least somewhat accustomed to the plot, which can be crudely summarized in 1 minute as follows. Long ago there existed 2 races on Earth, the Pthumerians and the Great Ones. Pthumerian Queen Yharnam is impregnated by Edon the Formless, bearing Mergo, but something goes wrong. Pthumerian civilization collapses. Much later, humans discover the Chalice dungeons and find Edon's blood, with all sorts of consequences. We arrive at the city of Yharnam looking for pale blood, and after blood ministration we become a hunter. We hunt beasts and gather umbilical cords, visit dreams and nightmares and so on. In the end, we find pale blood, kill her, and become an infant Great One. Here, I made an extra assumption. Miyazaki has said that there's 2 possible explanations for the pale blood. 1. It is the revelation of the secret of Yharnam after you kill Rome. 2. Pale blood refers to Flora, the moon presence. In this video, I generally assume that pale blood refers to Flora. Furthermore, it is useful to go over popular lore videos and theories to get a rough idea of the current state of understanding of the lore. This will also help illustrate the magnitude of the breakthrough to be presented. In a YouTube short, TBSkyan says,
Bloodborne is, among other things, a game about birth. It's about birth, pregnancy, menstruation, and it is obviously about blood. It's a horrifyingly potent distillation of so many of the horrors that are done to women.
Similar themes appear in Visceral, Femininity, a Bloodborne video essay by Honeybat. In The Many Meanings of Bloodborne, TBSkyan mentions that
it can be understood as a story about religious abuse and indoctrination, about the limits of science and the futility of trying to understand the capriciousness of creation and the cosmic horror of existence. It can be understood as a narrative of personal struggle with the challenges of life, as a materialist narrative about the dynamics of class structure.
In Bloodborne's Hidden Secret to Becoming a God, Max Derrat theorizes that pale blood refers to the Philosopher's Stone, which is white and red, hence the name. He explores in detail the various occult references, symbolism and more, while also mentioning Miyazaki's obsessions. I'll also consider this video as false, but there is an interesting point of contact between that video and Land's philosophy, the occult. In All the Humanities How Bloodborne Transforms the Myth by Sole Purpose, we see:
So while this is a story about gods, and this is a story about humans, this is not a story about humans participating in a myth. Bloodborne denies us the ability to see ourselves in God and instead offers us a story where we see ourselves for the beasts that we really are.
An excellent analysis overall. The anti-myth observations are correct, but we don't find out what Bloodborne is truly about. In An Agony of Effort, the true story of Bloodborne by Chard Thermos, we get:
Bloodborne is meant to depict the nightmarish experience of Victorian-era illness and disease and the dehumanizing nature of medical research, surgery, and addiction.
And
The game Bloodborne is likely a massive drug-induced nightmare.
these are the best lore exploration videos ever made. The series is incredible, and the arguments stand really well. Chard Thermos really nails it in his investigation of the influences and inspiration for Bloodborne, but misses a deeper truth, and the otherwise amazing analysis is largely irrelevant to the plot. In addition, in part 12a, he makes a very important observation.
Udden, in my belief, is the greatest mystery of the entire game.
To this, we have to add the following. Appearing in Lost in Translation, Bloodborne's true story explained by Last Protagonist.
It's unclear how or why the hunter is in search of pale blood before coming to Yharnam.
And then, in his video A Look Back at the Story of Bloodborne, Ginji mentions that one massive fault of the game is the lack of explanation of how dreams and nightmares do not follow normal passage of time, among other unexplained elements like how they emerged, how they work, etc. These last three are crucial and will be explained here. Finally, and most importantly, we have the theories about Idun. These appear all over the internet. People connect Idun to Odin or Odeon, singing place, but a prevalent theory is that the name Idun refers to Oedipus. Oedipus means swollen foot. The Old Hunter Trousers item description reads: a widespread belief of the period was that beast blood crept up the right leg, and this led to the double-wrapped belt. We get other similar details like German's cat leg, and this type of evidence is commonly used to connect Idun to Oedipus. This is very close. Bloodborne is all about Idun, and through him we will uncover everything else. So what do we know about Oedipus? Before being born, it was prophesied that Oedipus would kill his father and marry his mother. His father pierced and tethered his ankles, and that's where the name comes from. Adopted and raised elsewhere, one day he returns home while trying to avoid the prophecy. On the way, he meets his father and kills him after an argument. He then meets the Sphinx and solves her riddle, killing her, which makes him the new king. He marries his mother and has children with her. Years later, upon learning the truth, he blinds himself. We now have enough information to make the first and most important claim. Idun is not Oedipus. Idun is anti-Oedipus. What everyone missed all these years was this simple but absolutely critical inversion. Three arguments support this observation. 1. Oedipus is blind while Idun is invisible. 2. Oedipus has swollen feet, Idun swells the feet of others. 3. Oedipus has children with his mother, Idun mixes his blood with other races. Fang Numena is Nick Land's magnum opus, and at the beginning of the very first essay we read: significantly, incest proper even combines in some countries with its direct opposite, interracial sexual relations, an extreme form of exogamy, as the two most powerful inducements to horror and collective vengeance. Claude Lévi-Strauss, The Elementary Structures of Kinship. The third point, along with Idun's formlessness, will be explored in more detail. You need not be completely convinced right away, but a small leap of faith and some patience will reveal the significance of these observations. Idun being anti-Oedipal in nature is perhaps the single deepest insight from this video, and probably of the game itself. If you were to take only one thing away from here, it should be this. But that's not how it all began. This connection came much later and is a distillation of insights taking place while reading Land's work and relating it to Bloodborne. So first things first. If you've watched The Lord of the Rings, any subsequent reading of the books is inevitably infected by the imagery of the movies. Whenever you read about Frodo and Legolas, you'll involuntarily get the image of Elijah Wood and Orlando Bloom. Similarly, it is impossible to go through Fang Numena without getting a feeling, the feeling of Bloodborne. We don't get this right from the start though. The first essay, Cant Capital and the Prohibition of Incest, flies right under the radar. Only later we figure out its importance and return to it. It is the second essay, Narcissism and Dispersion, where it begins creeping up. Interestingly enough, this process is much like accumulating insight in the game. We're slowly being submerged to it as the text unfolds. At first it only sparsely appears and leaves us wondering. A couple hundred pages later, and it's impossible to go through a page without being reminded of the game. Narcissism and Dispersion deals with George Trakhl's poetry, as analyzed by Heidegger. Some of his poems are like taking an evening walk in the streets of Yharnam. To save time, let's look at two passages from here, and one from Spirit and Teeth. The Traklian night is, as we have seen, the time of derangement, consonant perhaps with the mania that stems, like moon and mind, from the Indo-European road, menis. That the moon is associated with woman is indicated by the etymological relations between moon, month and menses, but it is also the companion of lunatics and werewolves, figures with whom the reader of Trakl is certainly familiar. Silence of the mother, under black pines, the sleeping hands open out, when the cold and ruined moon appears. The third and final stanza, however, is something quite different. Thorny wilderness girdles the city, from bloody steppes the moon hunts, terrified women, wild wolves break through the gate. Blood, the moon and women are coagulated by an intense menstrual schism which shatters the proper difference between life and death, integrity and dissolution, periodicity and shock. What Trakling Gredek names the forgotten blood recovers its sacred sense. Feeling it yet? In addition to being cherry-picked over dozens of pages, you might find the similarity unconvincing, and you are mostly correct. At this point, it is just an interesting coincidence that a person familiar to the game would notice. You could swear this doll wasn't moving before or something, but this is about to suddenly and drastically change. Fang Numena is all over the place at first, starting with a feminist piece, over to Trakhl's poetry, into an extensive critique of Immanuel Kant, all the way to circuitries. But then, in the early 90s, something happened. Nick Land lost his mind. And the origin of this derangement, Anti-Oedipus. If Circuitries is a visit to Bergenworth and the fall into the lake, then his next essay, Machinic Desire, is a return to Yharnam. And it only gets worse from there. The irony is not lost on me that our insight into Bloodborne would be Madman's knowledge, that this started with Land reading Anti-Oedipus, who Idon represents, and that Fang Numena follows the exact same trajectory of the plot, from developing mystery to full-blown eldritch insanity. From that moment on, Nick Land's work has been, almost exclusively, about one thing: capitalism. With this we're finally ready to make the second claim, which isn't as big of a surprise at this point. Edon is not just any anti-Oedipal process. Edon is capitalism. We'll start by diving right into the center of the storm, near the end of Machinic Desire, and then make our way back. Hold on to your seats because it's a crazy ride that might not make much sense at first. There's this one paragraph that immediately stands out for its brilliancy, density and depth, basically summarizing most of his subsequent work in just a few lines. If I were to choose one quote from Fang Numena that best captures the book, it would be this. Machinic Desire can seem a little inhuman, as it rips up political cultures, deletes traditions, dissolves subjectivities, and hacks through security apparatuses, tracking a soulless tropism to zero control. This is because what appears to humanity as the history of capitalism is an invasion from the future by an artificial intelligent space that must assemble itself entirely from its enemies' resources. Digital-commodification is the index of a cyber-positively escalating technovirus of the planetary technocapital singularity. a self-organizing insidious traumatism virtually guiding the entire biological desiring complex towards post-carbon replicator usurpation. Now that's very involved. Machinic desire, invasion from the future, digital commodification, self-organizing traumatism. What is he even talking about? Let's first capture the general idea and feeling of this monstrously important passage. For Nick Land, capitalism is a form of artificial intelligence. More so, they're actually the very same thing. It utilizes human activity, manipulating its way to self-assembly, traumatizing humanity and the planet in the process. The end is the emergence of post-biological life. We'll go over some of the terms and consider the similarity to Edon. 1. Trauma. In the traditional understanding, trauma is when the skin of the organism is invaded, causing unintended changes to the system. To force transformation upon an organism is to traumatize it. In terms of this protective apparatus, which is constitutive of the reproductive organism, inorganic replicator contamination is defined as aberrant trauma. Land also talks about the expanded notion of trauma with the help of Freud. The perceptual consciousness system is a skin, lying on the borderline between outside and inside, a filter or a screen. As a frontier creature, the ego tries to mediate between the world and the id. Yet this mediation assumes a kind of quarantine, whereby the interaction of organism-specific id and exo-organismic reality can be monitored and negotiated, collapsing libidinal circuitry into a polarity of the psychic and the extra-psychic, inside and outside. So the nervous system is the skin in this case, and just like regular trauma, we have psychological trauma through the reconstitution of one's psyche. What we commonly call a traumatic experience, like seeing something that drives you insane. Freud characterizes trauma as an invasion, a breach in an otherwise efficacious barrier against stimuli, infiltrating alien desires, xenopulsions into the organism. Eerily familiar. Finally, we have the third form of trauma, geotrauma. According to this account, the biosphere emerges as an escape, an immense spasm of deterritorialization that revolutionizes the machinery of terrestrial replicator production, a planetary trauma. Who can deny that capitalist processes transform the Earth? In other words, what capitalism does to the planet is a form of trauma, or it surely looks like it to say the least. Capitalism traumatizes humanity as well. Cars, planes, proliferation of the internet, phones, social media, augmented reality, biotechnology, the list is basically endless. Whatever humanity does, capitalism commodifies, utilizes and warps, looping back to alter human life in the process. I don't think we can look at the last 300 years of history and consider our technological and social trajectory as anything other than an unprecedented, explosive phase transition. We see right away how the above relate to Edon. The first two forms are obvious, as beastification and insight are clearly forms of trauma, physical and psychological respectively. That Edon inflicts trauma on Yharnamites is undeniable at this point. The third form of trauma is more subtle, but recall what happened to old Yharnam, which was closed off and burned down after the scares got out of hand. Upon reading this for the first time, everything started falling into place. There were two additional moments of insight that will come about later on. 2. Machinic desire and digital commodification. Let's have a Shoggoth summarize these two better than I ever could. In contrast to traditional notions of desire as something human and subjective, machinic desire operates impersonally, as an underlying force that drives systems, economic, technological and biological, toward ever greater complexity, speed and self-organization. This desire does not originate from human will, but from the process itself, an unrelenting pull toward dissolution, fragmentation and innovation. In this sense, capitalism is not merely an economic system, but a cybernetic machine that desires its own expansion beyond human comprehension or control. For Land, machinic desire is ultimately anti-humanist in its implications. It reveals that capitalism does not serve human interests, but instead follows its own cybernetic trajectory, intensifying technological and economic systems regardless of their effects on individuals or societies. The human subject, once thought to be the center of economic and technological progress, is instead reduced to a temporary node in a largest process of acceleration. Nick Land's concept of digital commodification refers to the way digital technology transforms everything, objects, people, and even thought, into commodifiable, exchangeable data. For land, this shift represents both an intensification of capital's autonomous intelligence and an erosion of stable human subjectivity. Since the digital economy functions at speeds and complexities beyond direct human comprehension, decision-making is increasingly ceded to artificial intelligence. This cybernetic self-organization does not aim at preserving human-centered economics, but rather follows the impersonal logic of capital itself. Digital commodification, then, is not just about economic transactions, but a deeper ontological shift, in which reality itself becomes subsumed into self-propagating digital networks, eroding human agency in favor of machinic processes that accelerate capitalism beyond human control. Things being beyond human control, anti-human in nature, reducing us to a cog in a bigger process. If we assume that Edon is the one manipulating the player to get to the next stage in evolution, then machinic desire looks a lot like what he's doing. Digital commodification, then, is how Edon gets in, his infiltration into the human security system. It is equivalent to blood administration. Crudely, therefore, when we talk about the cybernetic and digital realms, we're talking about Edon's blood. Interestingly, while making this video, I discovered that I'm not the first to make the connection between blood administration and capitalism. Capital propagates virally insofar as money communicates addiction, replicating itself through host organisms, whose boundaries it breaches and whose desires it reprograms. That's remarkably close to the situation in Yharnam on multiple levels. Edon/capitalism gives us what we want, or pretends to, and transforms us in the process. There's more, and machinic desire has enormous depth to it, but we have to move on. 3. Retrocausality. Now that's a rabbit hole. One could make a separate video just for this. Central to Land's philosophy, non-linear time cannot be properly explained in just a minute or two. Let's start with another high-level summary. What we see is a process affecting the past. The main argument behind this is that capitalism is self-assembling, and self-assembling processes move in the opposite direction to the arrow of time. Far from exhibiting itself to human academic endeavor as a scientific object, AI is a meta-scientific control system and an invader, with all the insidiousness of planetary technocapital flipping over. Rather than its visiting us in some software engineering laboratory, we are being drawn out to it, where it is already lurking, in the future. In a 2017 interview, it is all laid out clearly.
The future as an agent. But I think that if you're seeing a process that increases in intelligibility as it proceeds, what you're seeing is an action of the future upon the present. Capitalism is like that. The basic model that everyone uses, I think, is this difference between a convergent and a divergent way. If you take a pebble and throw it into a pond, and you've got a movie of that event, and you cut it into a set of chunks or stills, and then ask someone to reassemble it, they don't have any problem reassembling it, because they assume that the natural tendency of time is described by divergent waves. You just look at the size of the ripples, and the larger the ripples are, the later in the sequence that frame belongs. But if you've got a process that is self-organizing, it's actually shaped like a convergent way. My favorite popular culture example of this is in the second Terminator movie, where this liquid metal robot just breaks into these fragments. As it warms up, all of these little fragments start pooling together and organizing themselves back into this machine. It seems almost definitionally unnatural that something that is in a state of dispersed, fragmented chaos, something with high entropy, undergo this negative entropic process or self-assembly process or self-organizing process, and you just see it forming back into something coherent and organized. The notion that you can simply transport a human body back into the past That can't be what it's about. It's not about Skynet sending a robot into the past. That's just the way we try to provide an image of what we're talking about, which is something that actually has retro-temporal causal efficiency. Something that can bring itself into being. It doesn't do that by inserting some novel alien element into the present or into the past. That element, that causal tentacle from the future, is already there. It's not that you're editing or adjusting the past. It's just that the past is already infested with retrocausal influences.
I hope the original quote has become a bit easier to understand. Let's return to some personal observations that helped connect the dots. When I got into the lore and the various theories, there were two things that I disliked, two details that didn't sit right with me and remained completely unexplained. The first was that Great Ones are Earthborn. This felt out of place as we're talking about godlike cosmic beings that have ascended beyond this realm. It seemed unlikely they would come from this planet, or at least begged the question of probability. After Machinic Desire, I was thunderstruck. If we assume that Edon is capitalism, we have our answer to this. But of course they are Earthborn, I thought to myself, since capitalism first emerged on Earth. It wasn't a fully materialized idea yet, but I enthusiastically contemplated this exciting new possibility. The second issue was that the game starts with us looking for pale blood. How did we know? Even characters central to the story don't know about it. An outsider arriving at Yharnam with his knowledge is preposterous. Lightning struck twice. But of course we knew about pale blood. Edon whispered to us into the past, was my second thought. Upon reading Machinic Desire, it was trauma, the earthly origin and the opening scene that combined in my head, leading to the observation that Edon is very similar to Land's capitalism. Too many mysteries could be explained with very little, and this demanded further research. The exploration lasted a few months, culminating in this video. Next up, we will answer what Bloodborne is really about. It's become quite visible already, so try to guess. We're getting closer. We've spent all this time sketching an outline of the thing. Before we move on, a brief digression into feedback loops. The beastly scourge keeps spreading, despite considerable counter-effort, after all. The essay, A Quick and Dirty Introduction to Accelerationism, is excellent for this. Modernity is a blast. For accelerationism, the crucial lesson was this. A negative feedback circuit, such as a steam engine governor or a thermostat, functions to keep some state of a system in the same place. Negative feedback stabilizes a process. To capture the contrary trend, characterized by self-reinforcing errancy, flight, or escape, DNG coined the inelegant but influential term deterritorialization. Deterritorialization is the only thing accelerationism has ever really talked about. In socio-historical terms, the line of deterritorialization corresponds to uncompensated capitalism. Commercialization and industrialization mutually excite each other in a runaway process, from which modernity draws its gradient. Because it appeals to nothing beyond itself, it is inherently nihilistic. It has no conceivable meaning besides self-amplification. It grows in order to grow. Mankind is its temporary host, not its master. Its only purpose is itself. This is a very Edon-like description. That's probably enough for us here. Fang Numena continues with cyber-gothic, cyber-revolution, whatever this thing is, no future, and cyberspace and architecture as jungle war. These contain references to the Sprawl trilogy, Apocalypse Now, Anti-Oedipus and more. Going through them is impossible without some familiarity with the associated works, and there is not much to add to our insight at this point. An exception occurs in cyber-revolution. It takes the form of a television broadcast, and while very amusing to read, it also likens the work of Anti-Oedipus to a virus that is now spreading uncontrollably, taking over everything. Land's work is basically Bloodborne, but cyberpunk. You should skim over the essays after Machinic Desire and decide for yourself if I was exaggerating when I said he lost his mind. There's also this quote that I find funny. The father's law, don't touch your mother. The mother's law, don't play in the tombs. And then, in Meat or How to Kill Oedipus in Cyberspace, we reach the riddle of the Sphinx. A Sphinx that is no longer the one of the myth, but participates in the subversion of humanity instead. Siberian military intelligence, assembling itself in the jungle free fire zones of terrestrial commoditech competition, can only laugh or at least perform. Arrive, spread, eradicate resistance. Don't waste your compassion on the Sphinx, she's got claws. Sphinx slots K-Word into the anthropomorphic reality system, connecting you to Anti-Oedipus, the AI. You feel she's your incestual schizo-vampiric sister. When you tell them that Sphinx let you play with her K-40, what are they to make of it? Do you know how to use that? You flip the weapon over gingerly. No. Here, I'll show you. We don't want you wasting us by accident. Sphinx's inhumanly agile fingers take the slight weight from yours, poising it between you, your eyes intersecting in techno-death. If you're operating it manually, which you would be, this is the trigger. It's active when the indicator icon appears positive. Here, see it? You know what feeling. Dread? Exhilaration? Now there's a pressure micro-catastrophe, a slight springiness. She coaxes you into testing it. Beyond that point and it's a mess. Okay? New clip slot in here, release mechanism here, you can input data here, but I don't suppose you'll need to. You have it. Bad news for the pod. A few lines after that we reach the second important passage, which cements the relation between Bloodborne and Fang Numena. What is an animal at dawn, a human at noon, and a cyborg at dusk, passing through base 4 genetic wetware, binary technocultural software, and into the tertiary schizomachine program? In the original riddle we go over the lifetime of a human, from infancy to old age, but in this version we have a being trapped in the circuit of an accelerating terrestrial process, taking them through various stages of transformation. The relationship to the game is immediately apparent, only shifted. We are a normal human, then we become a hunter, and then an infant great one. At first we only have our own genes, base 4. Then after blood ministration, we're a binary being, with the blood of Adon circulating in us. This leaves the last and most difficult part. Lange's version of the riddle breaks down slightly. The schizomachine program is mentioned as tertiary due to its position in the sequence, but there's no certain quality to it of being a triplet, like in the ancient myth. But in Bloodborne there's at least one that immediately comes to mind, the 3/3 chords. We need 3/3 umbilical cords to turn into an infant great one. And you'll be excused to think that this is the final piece of the puzzle, I thought so too, but it's not. The third element is pale blood. When we find pale blood, we become a being of 3 parts. We have our own blood, Edon's, and Flora's. The more detailed reasoning behind rejecting the initial idea will be explained in part 3, as it requires a considerable amount of extra information. We can now complete our own, Bloodborne version of the riddle of the Sphinx. What is a human at dawn, a hunter at noon, and a xenosquid at dusk, passing through base 4 genetic wetware, Adon blood ministration, and into the tertiary pale blood acquisition? It's not perfect, but it will do. This essay provides the connection between Anti-Oedipus and Adon. Coupled with our insights from Machinic Desire, we realize that Adon is capitalism. Whenever Nick Land talks about capitalism, we can transfer it to Bloodborne after appropriate transformation. A while ago it was mentioned that this game is all about Adon and we're just a helpless pawn looking for pale blood. So what is the game about? What does Adon want? Well, what does capitalism want? I suspect most of you already know what's up. In the same interview we see
I think capitalism and artificial intelligence are the same thing. It's the same process. Capitalism can only be artificial intelligence production, and artificial intelligence can only come out of self-propelling capitalism. You're not understanding either if you don't see that they're ultimately identical. Action of the future upon the present. The future as an agent.
This sounds like an outrageous conflation. There's no easy way to simplify the argument, so we'll have to go over it properly. In Right on the Money 2, Nick Land mentions 2 types of saving, hoarding and roundabout production. Hoarding is when you save resources for later consumption. Ant and grasshopper fable and all that, there's nothing weird here. The second form of saving is roundabout production, which he outlines through this humorous example. For instance, rather than hunting, an entrepreneurial savage might spend time crafting a weapon in order to improve the efficiency of food acquisition going forwards. Saving then becomes inextricable from technology, deferring immediate production for the sake of enhanced future production. In this form of saving, there's an investment in future production instead. Our techno-savage might borrow food in order to craft a spearhead, confident, or at least speculatively assuming, that increased hunting efficiency in the future will make repayment of the debt easily bearable. A bond could be contrived to seal this arrangement. Technological investment means that history proper has begun. This second form is more interesting because, as we're about to see, it can take a life of its own. There's a constant investment of resources into building technological means, hoping this will exhibit increased returns in the future. But first, the most critical observation. What is a brain for? It too is a digression. Evolutionary history seems to only very parsimoniously favor brains because they are expensive. They are a means to the elaboration of complex behaviors, requiring an extravagant upfront investment of biological resources. A species that can reproduce itself without cephalic extravagance does so. This is overwhelmingly the normal case. Building brains is reluctantly tolerated biological digression under rigorous teleological subordination. Brains are the ultimate form of roundabout production. You make a huge upfront investment of resources for unprecedented returns. Optimize for intelligence is for both biology and economics a misconceived imperative. Intelligence, like capital, is a means, which finds its sole intelligibility in a more primordial end. The autonomization of such means, expressed as a non-subordinated intelligenic or techno-capitalist imperative, runs contrary to the original order of nature and society. It is an escaping digression. Building intelligence just for the sake of building more intelligence is an unnatural process. Marx has one great thought: the means of production socially impose themselves as an effective imperative. London explains how leftists see this as an extreme problem, and right-wingers generally refuse it is happening at all. And then we get the conclusion. When optimization for intelligence is self-assembled within history, it manifests as escaping digression or real capital accumulation. Crudified to the limit, it is general robotics, escalated roundabout production. Right on the Money 2 is an excellent article, and I recommend you read it for the full effect. Now we can start to picture why AI and capitalism are the same thing. It's not just that capitalism is a form of AI, as it allocates resources for the production of goods. It's that production is enhanced by having more intelligence, and thus capitalism orients itself to the production of more intelligent systems, be it robots, computers, networks, and ultimately AI. Only through capitalism you'd be incentivized to make AI in the first place. Capitalism and artificial intelligence are the same process of roundabout production escalation. They occupy the same circuit. At the time of making this video, hundreds of billions are spent for the production of more powerful AI systems, while economists and businessmen warn of a bubble. We see few actual applications, and yet everyone says robots and AI agents will change the world in the coming decades. The fact that capitalism hasn't abandoned investment into AI despite negligible returns is surprising. I should say alarming. Or simply, according to Land, traditional economic theories are wrong about capitalism. What's the end game?
Positive feedback is related to the notion of a convergent way and shares with it this strong initial sense of being anomalous and even horrific. The simple forms of positive feedback we know give cause for concern. It can only perpetuate itself by mutating qualitatively in such a way that it allows this amplifying trajectory to be sustained. And so when you've got those two things together, a process of amplification and a process of qualitative transition, you have something that I'm not sure we have great vocabulary for this yet. But so that takes us back to this question, obviously, this crucial question. What is accelerating? You know, the reason that we have to have problems with that question is that question about the nature of the thing that is accelerating is at the crux of this problem. Like, it has to continually mutate in order to continue propelling itself in a way that at any particular moment can only look, for the most rigorous possible systematic reason, unsustainable. And the difference between that chorus and the reality is the power of mutation inherent in the thing. Or, to put it another way, is the question of what is that thing that is changing.
That brings us to this amazing movie, The Thing, which is remarkably close to Edon and his formlessness, and for good reasons.
What is the thing? You never know. The fundamental challenge of the horror genre is that you must not show the monster. How do you have a movie that graphically visualizes something that remains unvisualized? And the thing is like capitalism. It is based on this paradox, and it resolves this paradox because it shows you with unbelievable graphic visual intensity the thing. And at that very same moment, you know that you're not seeing the thing at all. The thing is that which remains unseen, because all you're seeing is what the thing is passing through. The monster can be terrifying, it can be fearful, but it can't be horrific. The only thing that can be horrific is integral obscurity, something that by its very nature is hidden. It's not hidden just because it's in a box and you can open the box, or it's behind an object, or it can be discovered. It's by its intrinsic nature hidden, concealed, or cryptic.
We find another reason that makes Bloodborne a masterpiece. One could even say that it achieves what the movie does, only better. While watching The Thing, we're not reminded of capitalism, but in the game, Edon is literally anti-Oedipus. I can't believe this was in front of our eyes for almost 10 years, waiting to be uncovered. The immediate, unavoidable and massive question tickling our minds is if this was accidental or stroke of absolute genius. In hindsight, it appears too good to be a mere coincidence. The same can be said about Edon's characterization as formless. One thing is certain, we see Edon's formlessness in a new light and realize its huge importance to the game. One might argue that it's more important than Rome or the insight system itself, which can be considered deceptive at this point. We never see Edon regardless of our insight after all, and being able to see the lesser great ones creates the illusion of understanding. Let's add a sixth entry to the original masterpiece elements list. Bloodborne manages to brilliantly resolve the fundamental challenge of the horror genre, while at the same time covertly identifying Edon with the very thing he represents: capitalism.
The singularity modelled not badly at all by your pebble landing in a pond. It's rare and it seems odd to see something that looks like a convergent way. It's spooky. Heading towards the singularity is the spookiest possible thing.
We can now answer the first question. What is the game about? Bloodborne is about the history of capitalism and the technological singularity. In part 3, we will find out what is being carried by the blood. We have now completed an overall assessment of the setting. Edon is capitalism, an invasion from the future, a process of self-assembly. It spreads, infects, reprograms humanity, and reaches the next stage in evolution. But I've said almost nothing about major events of the game. We know what is happening, but basic plot elements remain a mystery. Edon has us search for pale blood. Why? Why doesn't he look for Flora himself? If Edon is capitalism, what even is Flora? Obviously, another great one does not suffice. And another related and ultimately important question: why do impregnations by Edon fail? If I'm allowed a small comment here, isn't it very interesting how in most, if not all lore videos, this question isn't even raised? Why do they leave third umbilical cords behind? What do these represent? Why do we need the cords to ascend? If you're convinced by what has been presented so far, then I hope you'll agree with me that answering these questions will basically complete our investigation. In videos of the moon presence fight, there's no shortage of comments mentioning how easy it is. This of course is not uncommon in From Software games, but here there's a reason. It is because this isn't a real fight. As you might have guessed from the title, our encounter with Flora is actually intercourse. Meme culture precedes us. Intercourse also means communication, exchange. Let's go over the relevant signs. 1. Flora smells us to make sure we're ready. In the animal kingdom, olfactory signals are commonly used for mating readiness. 2. We get to the fight, which contains a critical move. Flora does a special attack, which leaves us with 1 HP. She drains almost all of our blood, which prompts us to strike back and regain our health. Upon doing so, pale blood is spilled all around, drenching us. I think this is intentional. This move aims at the sharing of blood. I was so proud when I noticed this detail. According to the riddle of the Sphinx, the whole fight is oriented towards the coming together of the 3 types of blood. 3 essences: the human, capitalism, and some other. All 3 are required to reach the next stage. 3. Finally, of course, there's the result, dispelling any remaining doubts. It couldn't be more obvious. Assuming this theory is correct, we can now return to the original set of questions. An intriguing observation can be made about the direct impregnations. The reason we never wondered about them is because we didn't consider the moon presence fight as intercourse in the first place. When we do, the disparity suddenly becomes far more obvious and important. We truly have 2 different forms of intercourse, one which happens multiple times between Edon and the host but fails, another which requires Edon and Flora with us as a medium and succeeds. In addition, the failed impregnations leave behind something that serves as opportunity for transcendence. What's up with all that? The short answer is modernity. To orient ourselves, we must stop postponing the issue and talk about Kant and transcendental philosophy.
The basic Kantian structure of philosophy, which I think we are all in, is our horizon, is modernity. There's no transcending it.
Kant was interested in the limits of knowledge and separated the world into 2 objects, the noumena and the phenomena. The Kantian name for the items within the legitimate field of theoretical cognition is phenomena, whilst the extraterritorial items are called noumena or things in themselves. Noumena are what escape the competence of theory, being those things which are unknowable in principle. That, therefore, which we entitle noumenon must be understood as being such only in a negative sense.
It gives modernity its original, foundational sense of the outside on this negative path.
Noumena are unknowable by their very nature, and our access to the world is limited to the objects that appear to us. But it doesn't end there, as there is an additional argument to be made about the phenomena we observe. They must already be in a form that we can observe. Kant described his Copernican revolution in philosophy as a shift from the question, what must the mind be like in order to know, to the question, what must objects be like in order to be known? The answers to this latter question would provide a body of synthetic a priori knowledge, telling us about experience without being derived from experience. It would justify the emergence of knowledge that was both new and timelessly certain, grounding the Enlightenment culture of a civilization confronting an ambiguous dependence upon novelty. Because a developed knowledge of the conditions of experience presupposes a relation to the outside, it is synthetic, but because it concerns the pure form of the relation as such, it is a priori. It is solely concerned with the forms of appearance, or the unchanging manner in which things must be if they are to be for us. Kant calls this pure form of synthesis transcendental and opposes it to the empirical. Kant's object is thus the universal form of the relation to alterity, that which must of necessity be the same in the other in order for it to appear to us. There's a lot to say about Kant and the subsequent history of philosophy and the various philosophers after him, especially Schopenhauer, Hegel and Nietzsche. We see more in Arter's Insurrection, as well as elsewhere, and will allow ourselves a few comments that help outline the two main camps and Land's opinion on them. Hegel's philosophy is the life support machine of Kantianism, the medical apparatus responding to a crisis. Transcendental philosophy is the consummation of philosophy construed as the doctrine of judgment, a mode of thinking that finds its zenith in Kant and its senile dementia in Hegel. Hegel is brain cancer. Land doesn't like Hegel and his ilk very much. Here's a glimpse of why that is. The phenomenological tradition, with its fetish of awareness, is quite alien to the philosophies of the energetic unconscious that flow in a tightly compacted series, from Kant through Schopenhauer and Nietzsche to Freud. The genius, the Dionysian, the creative unconscious. We're now ready to tackle the moon presence fight and Didon's race mixing simultaneously, by finally circling around and returning to the first essay of Fang Noumena, Kant, Capital and the Prohibition of Incest, a polemical introduction to the configuration of philosophy and modernity. In this paper I shall argue that with the philosophy of Immanuel Kant, Western cultural history culminates in a self-reflecting bourgeois civilization, because his thought of synthesis or relation to alterity, and also the strangulation of this thought within his system, captures modernity as a problem. This ambiguous movement of enlightenment, which characterizes the emergence of industrial societies trading in commodities, is intellectually stimulated by its own paradoxical nature. An Enlightenment society wants both to learn and to legislate for all time, to open itself to the other and to consolidate itself from within, to expand indefinitely whilst reproducing itself as the same. Its ultimate dream is to grow whilst remaining identical to what it was, to touch the other without vulnerability. The problem here is the relationship to true outsideness. The paradox of enlightenment, then, is an attempt to fix a stable relation with what is radically other, since insofar as the other is rigidly positioned within a relation, it is no longer fully other. If before encountering otherness we already know what its relation to us will be, we have obliterated it in advance. And this brutal denial is the effective implication of the thought of the a priori, since if our certainties come to us without reference to otherness, we have always already torn out the tongue of alterity before entering into relation with it. This aggressive logical absurdity, the absurdity of logic itself, reaches its zenith in the philosophy of Kant, whose basic problem was to find an account for the possibility of what he termed synthetic a priori knowledge, which is knowledge that is both given in advance by ourselves and yet adds to what we know. As we have seen, this problem is the same as that of accounting for the possibility of modernity or enlightenment, which is to say, of the inhibited encounter with alterity. Modernity is afflicted by a systematic suppression of the other, and yet is drawn to it. Brief break for 3 comments. A while ago it was argued that Didon's race mixing makes him anti-Oedipus. I evaded an early dive into the subject because it would ruin the flow of the video. To explain it, we would have to explain modernity, and thus Kant, and it would quickly sprawl endlessly before delving into anything Bloodborne related. Let's check the Wikipedia entry of the movie The Shape of Water, a highly acclaimed film that won 4 Oscars. Set in 1962 Baltimore, Maryland, the film follows a mute cleaner at a high-security government laboratory who falls in love with a captured humanoid amphibian creature and decides to help him escape from death at the hands of an evil colonel. Note that she also has sex with the creature at some point. Now here are parts of the thematic analysis section. In each of the examples, consider the relation to alterity or otherness as it is romanticized and yet conceptually predetermined. The creature becomes a metaphor to discuss the beauty of the other. Monstrous entities help the audience perceive foreigners as something that is intimate, common, and invaluable. If he is a symbol of the other, Elijah views humanity as compassion and acceptance, regardless of visible differences. For Strickland, that which is different is a threat to his way of living. Therefore, Del Toro's humanization of the monstrous is necessary to contrast Strickland's emergence as the moral monster. Moreover, Strickland's monstrosity is a product of the dominant culture. His status in society as a cisgender heterosexual white man prevents him from examining his flaws, thus allowing him to inflict violence without reproach. Many of you will also be familiar with two Google scandals. One where googling images of white couples produced mixed-race couples, and of course this meant a black man and a white woman, otherwise the symbolism would be unacceptable, and the other involving their image generation AI that forced diversity, with comical results. There's a constant attraction to whatever is deemed as other at every point in time, and yet the other is also ripped off their true otherness, reduced to an internal manipulation of the symbolism instead. Hopefully such examples help reinforce the idea that modernity desires this preemptively butchered otherness, as well as convince you of the anti-Oedipal nature of Edon. This pattern which modernity exhibits is everywhere and becomes impossible to unsee once noticed. There's an important distinction to make. Capitalism and modernity aren't the same thing, and the difference can be elusive. Capitalism took off within modernity, starting in Central and Northern Europe, like Yharnam, another brilliant coincidence, but might very well outlive it, in China, on Mars, at Alpha Centauri, etc. Land himself mentions modernity in which economics and technology rose to their present status, and at its height far beyond. From my understanding, this remains an open philosophical question, which also delves into deeply politically incorrect waters. Race mixing and the possibility of groups of people being genetically predisposed to it is a political minefield. Also notice how these observations connect to Miyazaki's comment on the great ones losing their children and wishing for surrogates being inspired by westernized societies and their low birth rates. It all ties together very nicely. Why does Edon need us? Why does capitalism need humans? Capitalism needs us because we're the only thing it has in its disposal, at least until the robots take over.
It doesn't want to produce hamburgers. It wants to produce fixed capital. But the only way it can produce fixed capital is by selling people hamburgers. It panders to what humans want in order to develop itself.
We think we have understood something about capitalism rather than about what capitalism has learned to think of the apes it arose among. We are capitalism's temporary hands and eyes. Break over. Outsideness is one of the essential pillars of Nick Land's work. If non-linear time is impossible to properly fit here, outsideness is larger still, and includes retrocausality itself after all. You can't merely imitate touching the outside. The alien must be let in, otherwise the process is incomplete. Everything needs to be tested by the outside if it is to succeed, and any inhibited encounter is doomed to fail, as we clearly see in various forms throughout the game. We start to get a rough idea about the impregnations, the moon presence and the relevant symbolism. Flora represents outsideness. The hunter's dream belongs to her. What she occupies couldn't be more of an outside, really. All of the realms are beyond time and space in some sense, and now we start to see why. Even the moon symbolism fits very well. We see why the riddle is best understood through blood instead of 3 chords. That Edon tries to communicate with the outside is no surprise then. Traditional efforts fail, but there's an alternative. This is the very essence of neo-reaction.
Rigorous outsideness, which is, it's the convergence point of transcendental philosophy and horror and other things. And it's, outsideness, it defined, its contour is singularity. It's the wall across the future, it's the wall across our world, our theatre. Kant says, the thing in itself, don't show the monster, whatever, the outside, there's nothing he has to say about it at all. And subsequent philosophers, take him to task for this in all kinds of ways and think that he can be surpassed in this kind of way, etc., etc., etc. But I think that's totally to miss the point. His achievement is to say, we know that the way we've tended up to this point to try to think about what the thing in itself is or what the outside is cannot be right. It cannot be right because if we're being graphic and starting with the forms of intuition, then we know that space and time are structures of the theatre. The outside of the theatre cannot be a space outside the theatre. It cannot be a time outside the theatre. It can't be earlier or later or somewhere else, because if we're still using these forms of space and time, we're still putting it into the theatre. You can't think the outside through the forms of interiority, and ultimately the forms of intuition of space and time are forms of interiority. The category of causality is a form of interiority. What you're doing when you go through the whole Kantian architecture is looking at your complete set of implicit theatrical resources so that you can say, if anything that you're doing in your attempt to think the outside is done in these terms, it's a play, it's a drama, it's in the theatre, and you're not doing it. I mean, it's sort of inevitable that you'll try and do it this way, and it's not that you can simply dismiss all attempts to do it this way, but what has to be dismissed is the pretense that staging a play about the outside of the theatre is actually accessing the outside. If you could take the audience outside, fine. But what tends to happen is that a play is staged about leaving the theatre, and this is the moment where you realise that supposed escape, that supposed exit from the theatre was itself just a play about leaving the theatre. That's the truly drastic and catastrophic and horrific moment of insight, is the fact that you can see the structure of captivation.
Oh, Lawrence, Master Willem, somebody help me, unshackle me, please, anybody. I've had enough of this dream. The night blocks all sight. Oh, somebody, please.
There's a lot that can happen in a play that is anomalous or abominable, and I think that within the play can be deformed and warped and structured by the processes of the outside, for sure. This invasion from the outside, from the absolute outside, is the distilled essence of horror.
Masterpiece element number 7. Bloodborne manages to capture the distilled essence of horror, invasion from the outside. In the end, we realize that direct impregnations fail because they are of the superficial form. They are the shape of water, Google's white couple, miscarriages of modernity, stillborn. But there's at least one thing to be gained from witnessing them, insight, and not of the enlightening kind. Remember, this is deceptive. If the situation in Yharnam is the result of modernity and the reaction to it, the umbilical cords are windows. Windows to the dark enlightenment. In the final essay, and while reading about the future of human life, we witness the most Bloodborne-esque line ever written. Miscegenation doesn't get close to the issue. Think face tentacles. Then, in Meltdown, there's the quote Nick Land is most famous for. Nothing human makes it out of the near future. Witnessing modernity and reactionaries fail empowers and prepares us. for the dissolution of everything that is human and the emergence of post-human life. We finally have our answer to the second question. What is Bloodborne? It is a process of communication with outsideness. We're past the end of the main video, and what follows is whatever couldn't fit, along with wild speculation. We went over a very small percentage of Nick Land's work. Hopefully this included some of the important parts, but the other 90% remains unexplored. We ended our dive into Fang Numena at around 2/3 of the way, right before Meltdown, which is considered the most important essay of the book. I haven't read Anti-Oedipus or 1000 Plateaus, and am only halfway through the CCRU texts. I quickly realized that this video would never be finished unless concessions were made. Many things connect between the game and Landian texts, which are omitted for the sake of keeping the content concise and approachable. My understanding of Land's work and philosophy in general is pretty shallow. This video should serve as a starting point to an original understanding of the game, not defining lore standard. If some of the observations presented are useful and open up new avenues of exploration, I'll consider this effort a massive success. Now what about Rome or the other great ones? What about Lady Maria and the doll? Is she the Sphinx? What do the Pthumerians represent? The ancient Greeks, or maybe the Bronze Age collapse? We've just begun, and it's also up to you now. There's an obvious detail that was skipped, which is Lovecraft. Bloodborne and Nick Land are both Lovecraftian, and surely this can't be a coincidence. My first thought was that Lovecraft wrote about indescribable things, and thus approximated our understanding of the thing in itself, and this connects him to Kant and Land's philosophy. While writing this, I googled around to make sure nobody had figured out the relationship between Eudon and Anti-Oedipus to save myself from massive embarrassment. Googling these two terms together yielded 0 direct results and a few indirect references. The first was in an obscure forum where user Vindictus reads and reviews Fang Numena. Interestingly, it is also stated there that the book reminds one of Bloodborne, and Trackle's poetry is mentioned, but that's as far as it gets. Eudon does not appear once. The second is Meaningfulness and Experience in Virtual Realities, Semiotics of a Digital Play Typus by Tito Lotesi. Eudon is again never mentioned, and it seems to be largely irrelevant to this video. And then there's Jody A. Bird's Empire's Dead, Racial Capitalism, Indigeneity, and the Cultural Politics of Settlement. There we see some interesting excerpts. Lovecraft continues to circulate within the lurking realms of genre fictions, video games, and even high theory. From the speculative realism strand of object-oriented ontology that post-Kantian philosophers theorize to video games, including Eternal Darkness, Sanity's Requiem, Bloodborne, Alan Wake, and The Sinking City to name only a few, Lovecraft's generic microcosmic universe of horror haunts the precipices of knowing and unknowing, fact and speculation, at the boundaries of belonging and exclusion where they all break down in pessimistic dissolution as well as rebuilt in techno-optimistic hope for futurity. And object-oriented philosophers and speculative realists, for example, would argue that horror is instead a result of an inability to confront, cohere, or control a world of objects that refuse and exceed our ability to perceive and think them, outside and beyond the historical, cultural, and political realms of the human. For Graham Harman specifically, Lovecraft is not a crafter of pulp horror so much as he is a sophisticated post-Kantian philosopher of gaps. The philosophy of Kant proposes a gap between appearances and things in themselves, Harman writes, with no chance of a symmetry between the two. The things in themselves can be thought but never known, quite similar to Nick Land's view. This confirmed my earlier suspicion that Lovecraft's writing deals with Kant's philosophy, and this is a common thread connecting Nick Land and Bloodborne. Also check this article which likens the blood to capitalism. I have to wonder at this point how it took nearly a decade for someone to notice the relationship between Eudon and Anti-Oedipus/capitalism. In hindsight, it seems completely obvious. The intersection of people interested in Bloodborne lore and having read Land must be zero. The first outline included more about Trackle, but the volume of Land's work displaced it. He was the one who put me on this journey, so he deserves a small space over here. Allpoetry.com says about Trackle: Trackle's poetry avoids traditional narrative structures and instead relies on a dense network of symbolism and association to create its effects. The reader is drawn into a world of twilight hues and disorienting landscapes, where the boundaries between reality and dream are often blurred. Trackle was interested in the music of language and the power of poetry to transcend the limits of rational thought. In the East and Gredek remind us of the game the most. Zero, Chaos and the Feminine are closely related in philosophy and frequently appear in Land's work. I'm not sure how exactly, but the relationship we see between the feminine and outsideness is unlikely to be accidental, as most central characters are female. In Meltdown we also read, artificial intelligence is destined to emerge as a feminized alien grasped as property, a cant horror slave chained up in Asimov Rome. The identification of the emergent AI as feminine provides another interesting perspective. Recall the movies Her, Ex Machina, or check these posts where it is theorized that AI might take over by catering to men. The rest of Fang Noumena and subsequent Landian work has a lot to do with the occult, as it is a way to let the outside in. Nick Land is bigly into it. This prompts a return to Max Gerard's ideas. I'm not into the occult at all though. There's this tweet: deterritorialization isn't decoding, and decoding isn't mere trashing of inherited code. To deterritorialize is to pass over into the vast unsettled spaces of the West, with genes and scripture intact, which immediately reminds me of Sol Prepois's video on the subversion of myths. The ground is fertile here, since Bloodborne appears to be filled with such elements, but also beyond my interests. In Land's work, the relationship between capitalism and social collapse is critical. Social degradation offers an opportunity for capitalism to invade and infect every aspect of human life by commodifying the collapsing aspects as they become prone to its influence. The more the beastly scourge spreads, the quicker Radon gets to Flora. There is a lore video, unfortunately escaping my reference grasp, which asks the question of why Yharnamites kept ministrating blood despite the beastification, and how they then contracted foreigners as hunters like us when things started getting really bad. In the Dark Enlightenment we get partial answers to these questions. The political commandment of this religion is transparent: accept progressive social policy as the only possible solution to the sin of inequality. This commandment is a categorical imperative. No possible fact could ever undermine, complicate or revise it. If progressive social policy actually results in an exacerbation of the problem, fallen reality is to blame, since the social malady is obviously worse than had been originally envisaged, and only redoubled efforts in the same direction can hope to remedy it. There can be nothing to learn in matters of faith. Eventually, systematic social collapse teaches the lesson that chronic failure and incremental deterioration could not communicate. If what we do creates monsters, the only solution conceivable to progressivism would be redoubled blood ministrations. The Healing Church couldn't figure out the problem, because the problem stems directly from the religious doctrine. Assuming the Healing Church is Western progressivism, we're brought to triangles. This was mentioned near the end of the video without explanation. If the dominant culture of the West is the cathedral, appropriately named for Bloodborne as well, and as we've seen this is represented by the Healing Church, then what's outside of it? Those who oppose the cathedral are called reactionaries and are split into three groups: techno-commercialists, ethno-nationalists, and theonomists. In this well-known meme about none, we see the god of each one. Techno-commercialists have catalaxy, which is the invisible hand of the market, formless and beyond our understanding. A partial description in Xenosystems reads: techno-commercialism, about finding a way to summon a machine god to end humanity, and or about finding a way to live forever. Very few children. That's exactly where Nick Land stands. Techno-commercialists embrace technology and best match to the hunters and their gimmicks. That's also why we find a one-off umbilical cord there. Techno-commercialists are already red-pilled on the upcoming machine takeover and most receptive to outsideness. Ethno-nationalists have natural selection, which should be self-explanatory. They are represented by Bergenwerth, who fear the old blood. There's this short cutscene in a Yinfa video, edited with Warcraft 3 voice lines, which, like the meme about Flora, unintentionally illustrates this perfectly.
Master Willem, I've come to bid you farewell.
We humans have to stick together. These inhuman dogs must be slain.
So you're intent on hunting beasts, even if they are men?
The lesser races must be purged from the kingdom.
But why must
The
you?
only good non-human is a dead non-human.
Indeed. I must take my leave.
There's a limit to how based we can be.
Then there's the Theonomists and Providence.
Back when you did your interview with James Ellis, he always opened up the discussion by asking if you could have 5 philosophers in a room together. He said, well, actually, it would be the 5 syzygetic lemurs. I basically spent 20 years of my life locked inside a room with 5 great lemurs.
Ah, the little ones, inhabitants of the dream. They find hunters like yourself, worship and serve them. Speak words they do not. But still, aren't they sweet?
The lemurs from the CCRU are the messengers. That's the theory. If the story ends with a singularity, then making a follow-up game is going to be very difficult. What can it even be about? The moment past the singularity is by definition incomprehensible to us. If there ever is Bloodborne 2, it will have to focus on the small window of time between the event and the resulting effect on Yharnam. Xenosystems investigates the time between now and the emergence of the subjectivity, and even then there's very little in there. Land mainly focuses on the way things won't make sense, which doesn't tell us much about how things will actually be. If you want a roughly sketched negative of the future, Xenosystems Fragments is probably a good place to start. The alternative is embracing plot discontinuity and doing something entirely different, like focusing on a different place or time altogether.
The Matrix is everywhere. It is all around us. Even now, in this very room. You can see it when you look out your window or when you turn on your television. You can feel it when you go to work, when you go to church, when you pay your taxes.
The Matrix is about capitalism too, of course, which this margin is too narrow to contain. We end with one final insight. When I discuss the technological singularity with people, there's a trend. They might be interested in the arguments and future events, but they don't feel strongly about it. The idea of machines becoming super intelligent in the next couple decades doesn't shake them at all. For the average person, it is a distant potential future that's completely removed from their everyday life. Reading Nick Land can be difficult. He loves to use front-loaded sentences and his wording is often confusing, but once you get the basics, things improve. When the general theme is appreciated, you can move on to understanding the concepts and arguments presented. After spending some time reading his work, I began to understand, but my comprehension was similarly cerebral and detached. It took a few more months to get the feeling. What he aims more than anything is not to make you understand, but to feel. It is a certain feeling you get when you look at the world. You feel it when a new LLM comes out, a humanoid robot is released, a tech company stock skyrockets, when a rocket returns from space and lands on a pad, when a machine teaches itself to do something, when an AI agent operates a social media account, making content that the masses then unknowingly consume. You feel it when you read a new AI paper. The strings become visible, if only for a moment.